This took place roughly 8 or 9 months after I'd moved into my first home. I was 24 back then, newly graduated and working a solid job. The only important thing about the house was the basement. It was huge and mostly used for storage. The previous owners had divided it into sections using plywood walls and exposed studs. There was an open area at the base of the stairs, a laundry space, what seemed like a makeshift workshop, and then a strange back room that functioned mostly as storage. The layout felt almost like a labyrinth. No single spot allowed you to see the entire basement, which I remember thinking was pretty neat when I first looked at the place. One night during the week, I went downstairs to do laundry, which was practically the only reason I ever went down there. I noticed the basement lights were already on, which struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. I'd been down there a few days earlier, so I assumed I'd simply forgotten to shut them off. Even with the lights on, the basement felt gloomy. I never replaced the old yellow incandescent bulbs that were already installed when I moved in. I started down the stairs, and everything spiraled out of control so fast that I didn't even have time to process it. I reached the bottom and headed toward the laundry area when something moved in the corner of my eye. I instinctively turned my head and found myself staring straight at a man crouched behind one of the folding tables. I'd set up near the far corner. The shock almost made me drop the laundry basket. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing. There was a complete stranger hiding in my basement. I froze. All I could do was stare at him while he stared back, and his expression was anything but friendly. He looked filthy, like he'd crawled straight out of a sewer. Then he stood up and ran, not toward me, but deeper into the basement, into the partitioned rooms at the back. That finally snapped me out of my fear. I began backing away toward the stairs, but I must have hesitated too long. Before I could reach them, every light in the basement shut off at once. I'd never been down there without lights before. I wasn't prepared for how dark it would be. It was absolute blackness, total and complete darkness. I foolishly assumed I knew my own house well enough and kept moving toward where I thought the stairs were. I was wrong. I tripped over something and crashed to the floor. When I stood back up, I had no sense of direction at all. Panic flooded my thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. My phone was upstairs on the counter, so there was no flashlight to save me. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, hoping it would scare off whoever had broken in. Instead, it seemed to excite him. From somewhere across the basement, I heard screaming in response. It was horrifying. I was yelling into the darkness, trying to sound unhinged, and someone on the other side was doing the exact same thing. Only his screams were far more terrifying than mine. He sounded genuinely murderous. I stopped screaming. He stopped too. I began feeling my way around the basement, using my hands to guide me. I didn't have any other option. That's when I heard movement behind me. He was doing the same thing. The sounds grew closer, and through all the terror, I got the unmistakable feeling that he knew the layout of my basement better than I did. I knew I was nearing the stairs, but the basement was enormous. Then I heard breathing behind me. I was certain he was about to catch me. After what felt like forever, my hand finally touched the wooden base of the staircase. I grabbed the railing and sprinted upward. Before I could even step onto the second stair, something seized my ankle. I lost my grip. My head slammed into the railing, and I tumbled back down to the concrete floor. I still couldn't see him, but I could feel him dragging me away from the stairs with strength that didn't feel human. I kicked and thrashed with everything I had, and somehow managed to connect with something. The impact was enough to make him loosen his grip. I twisted and flailed until I broke free. I ran blindly back toward the stairs. He started screaming again, but I reached them before he could grab me. I climbed out of the basement, burst through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. But it wasn't over. The door didn't have a lock. All I could do was throw my body against it and pray I was strong enough. Seconds later, I heard footsteps charging up the basement stairs, followed by a massive crash into the door. It flew open for a split second, and I used every ounce of strength to force it shut again. That first hit must have encouraged him, because he kept slamming into it over and over. I kicked off my socks to get better traction and pushed with everything I had, knowing my life depended on it. I don't know how he failed to break through, but eventually he stopped. I heard footsteps retreating down the basement stairs. I immediately ran for my phone, grabbed it off the counter, and rushed back to the door. With my back pressed against it, I called the police. When they arrived, the man was gone. I wasn't surprised. One of the basement windows had been pried open from the outside, and it wasn't hard to piece together what happened. Nothing had been stolen. One officer suggested the intruder may have been using my basement as a place to hide or live. That thought hadn't even crossed my mind, and somehow it was worse than the idea of a robbery. The other reason they believed this was because the intruder knew exactly where the light switch was, despite it not being in an obvious location. I moved out about 4 months later. Thinking back on it now, one thing feels certain. So that man was ready to kill me that night. And if things had gone even slightly differently, he probably would have. This next incident happened when I was 14. I'm in my 30s now, so this was nearly 2 decades ago. My parents had to travel out of state for a wedding and didn't feel comfortable leaving me alone, even though I was technically old enough. The plan was for my older sister to stay with me for the weekend. She was already in college and lived about an hour away. As soon as my parents left, she texted me saying she had a party to attend and wasn't coming after all. I didn't really care. I didn't tell my parents either, partly because I didn't want to worry them, and partly because I didn't want them arranging someone else to watch me. The house wasn't in a bad area. No, it was a normal 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, mostly families. I felt safe. The night started off completely normal. I played Halo for around 6 hours straight, something I usually never got to do. It wasn't until just after midnight that things started to feel off. I was still stretched out on the couch when I heard a faint tapping noise. It seemed to come from the backyard, and I assumed something was hitting the siding. That's exactly what it sounded like, so I didn't panic. A few minutes later, I heard it again. It sounded identical, making me think a tree branch was hitting the same spot. But then the tapping moved, as if whatever was causing it was traveling along the side of the house. That's when I knew something wasn't right. The sound felt deliberate, too deliberate to be the wind. I muted the TV and froze. I didn't move. I just listened. But there was nothing, only silence. After about a minute, I convinced myself it had been an animal or the wind and turned the TV back on. 20 minutes later, a new sound broke the calm, and it scared me far more than the first. It was tapping again, but this time it came from beneath me, from the basement. The living room sat directly above it, so there was no doubt. The basement was unfinished and had a small kitchenette, so it wasn't impossible to imagine an animal rummaging around down there. I muted the TV again and stood up. I didn't want to, but I had to check. I needed to reassure myself that nothing was wrong. The basement had several windows that opened directly outside. Most likely, whatever animal made the earlier noise was now hitting one of those windows. You were trying not to panic. I walked to the basement door and opened it. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below. The tapping was louder now, repeating every few seconds. I don't know why I did it, but I called out "hello" into the empty basement. The tapping stopped instantly. That was the moment I started getting a really bad feeling, because if it had only been an animal, there's no way it would have reacted to my voice like that. If I could have turned on the lights, I would have been able to see what was going on much more clearly. But the light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, and there was absolutely no way I was going down there. So instead, I slowly pushed the door shut until only a small gap remained and slid my hand through it. I aimed my phone toward where I knew the window was. Then I shut my eyes and recorded a short video with the flash on for a few seconds. Right after that, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I took a deep breath and played back the video. It was blurry and low quality, but it only took a second to see that there was a figure standing beneath one of the windows inside the house. I screamed. I couldn't stop myself and ran straight to my room. I locked the door and immediately called my dad, who then contacted the police for me. I was still on the phone with my parents when I started hearing loud, repeated banging on the basement door. Whoever it was trying to force their way into the finished part of the house. After the fifth or sixth slam, everything went quiet again. Not long after that, the police arrived. They searched the basement, but the man had already escaped through the window. The officers were kind enough to check the yard as well, but whoever it was had vanished. Several things were missing from the basement. Like I mentioned before, it wasn't finished, but that didn't mean my parents kept it empty. I don't remember everything that was taken, but the most disturbing part was this. When the police looked at the kitchenette, they noticed the largest knife from the rack was gone. Just thinking about that still scares me. If I hadn't had that video on my phone, I don't think the police would have taken the situation as seriously as they did. Still, nothing ever came from it, and this was almost 20 years ago now. I have no idea what happened to that old phone. It's probably sitting in a box full of junk at my parents' house somewhere, or assuming it even still exists. If I ever find it, and it still works, I'll submit the footage. This happened when I was 16, about 4 years ago now. I grew up in a large suburban home that my parents bought before I was born. From the outside, it looks completely normal, but once you're inside, there are all sorts of strange quirks. The biggest one by far is the basement. It's easily the largest room in the house. My parents finished it years ago and turned it into a laid-back hangout area with a sectional couch, a decent television, and a couple of storage rooms in the back. You'd think a space like that would be used all the time, but my parents prefer the living room upstairs, so the basement was basically mine. Another important detail is my cat. His name is Rocky, and he's one of those overly friendly cats who constantly demands attention. Because of that, my parents put him in the basement every night before going to bed, so he wouldn't bother them. Now here's where things start getting a little sketchy, and I'm just going to be honest, because there's no point pretending otherwise. The basement has an interior door that connects directly to the garage. It's technically meant for convenience, like carrying in groceries, but for me, it was convenient for sneaking people in. Anyway, this all happened on a Friday night. I remember that clearly because I had invited a girl named Malene over, which I wouldn't have done on a school night. I also remember assuming Rocky was already down there. It wasn't something I consciously thought about, more like an automatic assumption. It was past the time my parents usually put him down there, so I figured he was asleep, somewhere in the back. Like always. That's why I didn't panic when I heard a noise coming from one of the storage rooms. It was a light rustling sound, like something shifting around among the boxes. Honestly, I think I was justified in staying calm because it sounded exactly like something an energetic cat would make. Malene clearly tensed up, but I told her it was just my cat. Then we went back to half watching whatever was on the TV. But the sounds didn't stop. They weren't constant, but every few minutes, there would be another rustle or a dull thump. Each time, Malene would glance at me nervously, and I'd reassure her that Rocky was just very active and liked climbing on things, which was true. He did like climbing. I stayed completely calm until I heard scratching at the door at the top of the basement stairs, the door that led into the main part of the house. I immediately knew what that sound meant. It was Rocky scratching to be led into the basement, which meant he hadn't been down there with us. And that meant whatever I'd been hearing for the past half hour wasn't him. I didn't say anything right away, partly because I didn't want to scare Malene, and partly because I wasn't sure I trusted what I was hearing. But before I could react, Malene, who was sitting right beside me, suddenly started screaming like she was being attacked. I snapped my head around and saw her pointing toward the back of the basement. I turned farther and froze completely. Foam football was rolling across the floor, clearly just thrown from the storage room. Oh, someone was in there. I didn't see anyone. The back of the basement was too dark, but there was no other explanation. Someone was back there. Someone had been there the entire time. Without thinking, I grabbed Malene's arm and dragged her up the stairs. As soon as we reached the top, I slammed the door shut behind us, making sure Rocky didn't get down there. After that, everything turned chaotic. Malene was crying, which was bad enough, but I was shaking uncontrollably. I didn't even know I could be that scared. Eventually, my parents realized something was wrong and called the police, who arrived a few minutes later. I stood on the back deck the whole time, watching the garage to make sure the intruder didn't escape through it. Here's where things got strange. The police searched the entire basement, including the garage, but didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, and every basement window was locked from the inside. One officer suggested the intruder must have left through the garage before they arrived, but I know that didn't happen. I was watching the entire time. I would have seen them, but after checking the house, there was nothing more the police could do. Of course, my parents believed the intruder slipped away without me noticing. I could tell they were upset, especially my dad. But I don't care what they think. I'm completely certain no one escaped through the garage. There's only one way from the garage to outside, and I never took my eyes off it. We never got any answers, and to this day, I still don't have an explanation for what happened. I think every kid is scared of basements. Let's be honest, they're unsettling places. Even now, as an adult living alone, I still feel uneasy going down to the basement to do laundry at night, especially when I'm heading back up the stairs. But when I was a kid, I was absolutely terrified of the basement in my family's house. Ironically, all our video game consoles were down there since it was the only TV besides the living room and my parents' room. I believe this happened when I was 9, because I was still in elementary school, but close to the end of it. On weekends, I'd stay up late playing video games in the basement. One of my old favorites was Driver 2 on the PS1. For some reason, I could never beat it, and I spent countless nights trying. Well, it was one of those evenings when I was down there gaming. I normally avoided staying up too late, because the moment my parents fell asleep, I became terrified of being alone in the basement. Just knowing my mom or dad was upstairs watching TV gave me a small sense of comfort, knowing they were only a quick dash up the stairs away. Much like the house I live in now, my childhood home had the laundry and boiler room located in the basement. That room absolutely terrified me because it stayed completely dark at all times, with no windows whatsoever. On top of that, strange noises constantly came from in there, which I guess made sense, since it was a boiler room. There were plenty of moments where I'd pause my game just to listen closely whenever I thought I heard something unusual coming from that room, even with the door shut. That night, I actually did hear something strange, and it began with the slow creak of the laundry room door opening. That alone was enough to make me freeze and feel my stomach drop. The basement fell into an uneasy silence for a moment, and then I heard something I can only describe as a woman moaning or groaning in an eerie, almost ghostly way, and it sounded exactly like my mom. I was convinced it was her. I started laughing, and I'm pretty sure I said something like, "Nice try, Mom," assuming she was trying to scare me. Looking back now, even as a kid, I should have known something was wrong, because my mom was never the type to play jokes like that. Still, I walked toward the laundry room with a bit more confidence. When I stood in front of the open doorway, leading into the darkness, the groaning had stopped. I stared directly into the pitch-black room. As I moved closer, I could make out the silhouette of someone standing inside. "Mom?" I said, my voice suddenly uncertain. When I stepped close enough, I realized it wasn't her. I screamed and ran up the stairs into the living room. And my terrifying instinct was correct. My mom was there with my dad. They were already standing by the time I reached them, reacting to my screams. I yelled, "There's a woman in the laundry room." I remember them glancing at each other before both of them rushed down to the basement, slamming the door behind them. I sat there confused, terrified, but somewhat relieved, knowing my parents were down there. I remember sitting in the living room for what felt like a long time before my mom finally came back upstairs and told me to go to my room and go to sleep. I didn't question it and did what she said. I definitely struggled to fall asleep that night. The next morning, my parents told me they had one of their friends pull a prank to scare me and played it off like it was all just a big joke. I don't fully remember how much I believed them, but I know I asked who it was. My mom said it was a friend of hers from out of state who was visiting. I didn't push it, but as I got older, the name Debbie was casually mentioned by my parents a few times. Every time I asked who Debbie was, I got a different answer. When I was around 14, I randomly thought back to that night and decided to dig deeper. I found a family tree website and confessed that I briefly took my dad's credit card from his wallet to pay for the service, then put it back. I entered both my parents' names, among a few familiar names and many I didn't recognize. One thing immediately stood out. My mom had a sister named Debbie. I then Googled Debbie, along with my mom's maiden name, and an obituary appeared. She was dead. I ran to my parents to show them what I'd found and demanded an explanation. I remember the shocked, uneasy looks on their faces. Finally, my dad said to my mom, "Tell him." She then revealed that I had an aunt who was severely mentally unstable and had hurt many people, and it was best that she was kept away from me growing up. Debbie had apparently broken into or snuck into the house without my parents knowing. I had endless questions and demanded more answers, but they refused to say much else. They insisted everything they did was to protect me. Over the years, I'd bring it up occasionally, but they'd always shut it down and tell me to let it go. I never found out what they meant by her hurting people, but I have my own ideas. Thinking about it doesn't really help me anyway. It still makes me uneasy. What else were my parents hiding? What really happened to Debbie? Why was she in the basement? I sometimes wondered if my parents were secretly hiding her down there after something terrible happened. But that doesn't quite make sense, because I don't think they would have let me go down to the basement at all. I guess some questions are better left unanswered.